Good evening, everyone. My name is Fred Wary. I am the Townsend Martin Class of 1917 Professor of Sociology here at Princeton and the founding director of the Dignity and Debt Network. My work centers on questions of economic justice, with a particular focus most recently on the indignities of debt collection. And this fall, I taught a new intro-level course in the sociology department on police violence, Black Lives Matter, and COVID-19, which makes this evening a special treat for me. I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's event, The Purpose of Power. Our guest speaker is author and political strategist, Alicia Garza. Alicia founded the Black Futures Lab to make Black communities powerful in politics. In 2018, the Black Futures Lab conducted the Black Census Project, the largest survey of Black communities in over 150 years. Alicia is the co-creator of hashtag Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter Global Network, an international organizing project to end state violence and oppression against Black people. She also serves as the Strategy and Partnerships Director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, the nation's premier voice for millions of domestic workers in the United States. Additionally, Alicia is the co-founder of Supermajority, a new home for women's activism. Tonight, we are here to discuss Alicia's first book, The Purpose of Power: How We Come Together When We Fall Apart, which was released October 20th in 2020 with the One World group at Penguin Random House. Before I turn the virtual podium over to Alicia, I'd like you to know that this event is sponsored by Princeton's Public Lectures Spencer Trask Lecture Series. The series was founded in 1891 with the gift from Spencer Trask of the class of 1866 for the purpose of supporting public lectures at the university on subjects of current philosophical, artistic, or scientific interest. Our co-sponsors for tonight are the Carl A. Field Center and the Women's Center at Princeton. We thank you all for being here with us tonight. But one housekeeping note before we begin. Live captioning is available for tonight's event. Please take a moment to turn on this feature now if you'd like to view the captions. And now, it is my great pleasure to welcome Alicia Garza.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. It's such a treat to have you here, and I can't wait to dig in to the book. So let's talk about The Purpose of Power. Can you just give us a bird's eye view of what the book is about and why you decided to write it?
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much to Princeton for having me, and thank you to all the sponsors of this event as well. I just will start off by saying that the reason that I wrote this book is because this is the book that I wanted and needed when I was first starting out as an activist, and then, of course, moving into being an organizer. You know, for so many of us, we find out the things that we care about, sometimes because there's tragedies that happen in our lives, but oftentimes because we become made aware of the way that injustice is unfolding, and we're impacted by that, and we want to do something about it. But there's so many of us that don't know where to start. We don't know where to begin. We don't know who we want to do it with. We just know something needs to be done. And I thought that what I could do is make an offering, right? This is not a how-to book necessarily. It is an offering of lessons that I have learned from more than 20 years of organizing and activism, lessons that I'm unlearning, right? And lessons that I'm still learning about what it takes, what is required to be the kind of fighters that we need to be for this moment, and what is required for us to build the kind of movement that can be effective and impactful and last and be transformative. So that's the why of the book. And, you know, for me, as somebody who's been doing this work for a very long time, I know that the way that I have learned how to be in movement, the way that I have learned how to build movements is often because someone has shared their story with me. And I think because of the way that we tell stories about movements, we tell stories about leaders, and we tell the kinds of stories that are often ahistorical and lack context. The reality is every great leader that we know of, from Martin Luther King to Rosa Parks to Fannie Lou Hamer, right, gets lionized in a particular way. And then there was who they actually were. And I think it's important to pull back the curtains, right, on what this work entails, what it means to be somebody who is in this movement. And I wanted to offer my own story because I want people to see movement building and organizing as accessible, as something that they can do. I don't believe that movements are built or driven by people who, don capes and plummet into a place to save people. What I know is that movements are comprised of people who care to do something about the things that they can no longer abide by. And that can be every single one of us. And I hope that this book is a reference and a resource for you to be able to do the same.
Yeah, speaking of references and resources, one of the references you make in the book is thinking about how we define power, because you make it very clear that people often confuse what power is and what it isn't. And so can you talk to us a little bit about what you mean when you talk about power?
Absolutely. Power is one of the most important things that we can amass as movements. And I think often when we get involved in things that we care about, we get very involved in tearing the thing apart, right? Dismantling the thing. And that's good. There are a lot of things that are happening right now that need to be dismantled, that need to wither away, or that need to be pushed away. But there's also the process of building what it is that we want, right? And making sure that we are replacing the things that we don't want with the things that we do. And in order to do that, that also requires power. So I wanted to spend time in this book focusing us on what it is that we're doing inside of movements. Movements are what happen when people come together to change their conditions, and they have to build power in order to do so. And I define power as the ability to make the rules and change the rules. My friend Holly Mitchell gave me a definition the other day that I thought was so great, and I wish I had it when I started writing. It's so simple. She basically says, power is the process of who gets what, when, and why. And I keep that with me because I think it helps to orient us in our work. It helps to make clear what we do and what we don't do, and why, and for whom, and with whom, and because of whom, right? Power, though, there's many forms of it. And I think generally a lot of people who get involved in this work avoid power because of our experiences with it. Our experiences of power are that it is corrosive, that it lacks integrity, right? That it's corrupt. And in a lot of ways, there are many forms of power that do operate that way. But I think the task of our movements is to transform power into something that brings us closer to having the things that we need to live full and dignified lives, but that also transform the process of how it is that we're distributing resources, how it is that we are amassing resources, how it is that we are making decisions, and who gets to participate in that. Power is also about the ability to tell the story of who we are and who we can be together. And so when we look at our work through the lens of power, then we are better able to understand who's with us and who's not and why. But we're also better able to understand how far we still have left to go before we get there. And so the discussion of power for me is incredibly important. And it's something that I think every organizer should be oriented around.
And did you know when you were first starting the book that this was going to be a book about power and its purpose, or did things change in the course of the writing?
Things always are fluid when you're writing books. And this is my first book. I thought that this book was going to be very different. I thought that this book was going to be about Black Lives Matter. And I'm really glad that it's not. One, because the story of Black Lives Matter, I think, is still unfolding. And I didn't want to put a period at the end of that sentence. I think after the summer, we can understand why, right? This movement is very much still in development. It is still growing, and it is still expanding, and it's much, much bigger than me. So I didn't want to kind of come into this, right, from a perspective of, this is what Black Lives Matter is, this is what it isn't, this is what it does, this is what it doesn't do. Instead, I wanted to create some tools for people who are trying to find their way towards power, but also I wanted to give us some language to better understand how we get there and why we want to get there. So yes, this book did shift over time. I'm very, very glad that it did. And my hope, again, is that this is a tool that is useful for people who have been organizing for a long time. And I hope that this is a tool that is useful for people who are just stumbling upon activism and social change work right now.
And as I think about sort of people who are stumbling on social change work, we often find them in our classrooms. And so it gives me a lot of pride to say that you were an anthropology and a sociology major in college. And
Right.
it shows, right? As I'm reading this book, I'm seeing you tie your personal experience into these larger structural issues. And one of those experiences is with the police. So can you talk about the kind of policing you experienced at a critical moment in your life? And when I say critical, I mean it's when you and what your mom would call one of your little friends was caught with a bag of weed.
That's right. That's right. Thank you for that. Thank you. One of your little friends, which she was not, and she would remind me of that consistently. So look, I'm glad that you asked me about this because it's not something that people ask often. And I think there's a way in which the story that I told, and I'll give people the details of it in a minute, you can miss the nuances in it. And so I want to make sure that we kind of touch on those. So what I'm doing here is I'm telling a story about how policing was playing out in a wealthy community, a wealthy, mostly white community. And the reason that I'm telling this story is, one, because I'm giving you a sense of how I first start to come to understand, right, how policing operates and how it operates differently in different places. But it's also where I come to start to understand that policing is so very much based on discretion and not laws. And at the end of the day, that discretion is often racialized, it's often gendered. And that is important for us to understand about a system that is so very visible right now. And I think a lot of us are questioning, right? From the position of defunding police, right, to the positions of, Blue Lives Matter. There's lots of people in the middle who see police as the mechanisms of safety in our communities. And ultimately, because of the stories that we tell about police and policing, very often we hear the stories about the good officers or the few bad apples, as opposed to zooming out to better understanding how the system works as a whole and for what and for whom and why. And so in this particular story, I tell the narrative of how I got caught late night with a friend of mine from high school with a bag of weed in the car underneath my seat. And I got caught by a sheriff. So not a local police officer, but a sheriff, honey. And the sheriff put the weed back in my car and let me go. And I will say that the other part of this story is that I also ran into this officer about a year later after I had left for college and come back for a summer. And I ran into them at a coffee shop and I thanked them. I said, thank you so much for letting me go. And they said to me essentially that, everybody deserves a second chance. And that conversation would not have happened in many communities across the nation. It was happening in that one because it was a wealthy white community. It happened with me because of the address that I had on the license that I handed over to that officer, because of the car that I was sitting in, and also because of the young, blonde, blue-eyed woman that I was sitting next to. And in this story, I talk about how if I was with a Black man or another Black person in that car, our outcomes would have been very different. I talk about how if I had been in that car in a different neighborhood, our outcomes would have been very different. And so what I'm trying to do here is to zoom out from what I think is a very flat conversation about policing to making it more textured and giving it more of a three-dimensional nature, understanding that discretion is so much a part of policing, and that discretion is often racialized, it's often gendered, it's often sexualized, right? There are so many different angles and perspectives to how and why policing happens the way that it does and where it's happening at the same time.
One of the other things that happens in the book is that we get to hear a little bit about the relationship with your mother. As you describe her, she was a very loving person, but she did not play. So how did she influence who you are today?
You know, we are coming up on the 3-year anniversary of my mom's death. And it's interesting because, you know, in this moment, I'm reliving that through Facebook memories, right? So, you know, at this stage, 3 years ago, we had just learned that my mom had a terminal brain tumor. And, you know, for me, my mom is somebody who taught me my earliest lessons about politics, about being a woman, about being a Black woman, about survival, about dignity. And I'm deeply influenced by the lens that she gave me to see the world. Obviously, my mom and I were very close. We're also very different people. And one of the things that I really appreciate about my mom is that she really was a live and let live kind of woman. She thought that the things I did were bananas, but she also realized, right, that I had the right to do them, and she was going to support me to do them no matter what. And I think the other thing I would just offer about my mom that I really try to take with me all the time is that my mom really believed that we belong to each other and that we are responsible for each other. And what that looked like in her life was making sure that everyone had what they needed. And if she could lend a hand, she would. And she wouldn't talk about it, right? My mom was not, she was not somebody who ever talked about the things she did for other people. She just did them. And as a result, you know, when my mom was passing away, I got to hear all of these stories about this woman that I was very close with and the way that she had impacted the lives of so many people that she had come into contact with. And that sits with me because I think that it is reminiscent of the world that it is that we are trying to build. I think we are trying to build a world where we belong to each other, where our dependence on each other isn't parasitic, right? But it is cooperative and interdependent and respectful of the ways in which we need each other to survive. I will also say that, you know, one of the things I also really appreciate about my mom and the legacy that she has left for me is that my mom loved Black people. And I think in terms of the way that I was raised, even though I was raised in a very interesting kind of environment, right? And different environments over the course of my life. My mom really taught me what it was to be proud of who you are, to be proud of where you come from, and to know that where you come from has asset, it has value, right? She would talk to me a lot about, you know, our family and the land that we were from that is still in our family. She would talk a lot about why that was so important for Black families, right? To have land, to have those assets, and to be able to pass them on. She would talk a lot about what it meant to make sure that other Black people could live with dignity, and what it meant for me to be in the world, helping to encourage our people to have dignity and to love on ourselves and each other. So those are things that I take from her every single day. And I'm so grateful that these were things that she offered me.
It's really important, I think, in the book, the role family plays, the role that discretion plays and when it's practiced. And we also see the role that laws play and the courts play. And so we are increasingly seeing how being born in communities with those stand your ground laws, and even in places without it, that either small infractions or no infractions at all can lead to death or other penalties for Black and Indigenous people of color. And you write about August 2013, after the acquittal of the man who killed Trayvon Martin. And on your Facebook, you began with, quote, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter." And it was the hashtag heard around the world, and is believed to be the beginning of an important movement. So what have you learned in the years since that post went viral?
Mm. So much. I, am so honored to be literally the smallest piece of something so profound and so powerful. And I think it's important for us to recognize, right, that for a lot of people, movements start where they enter and they end where they leave. And I think there's another story, which is that these movements are much older than us. We get to inherit pieces of it for the purposes of pushing it forward, but we did not create it, right? The movement to save and to defend and to fight for Black lives began the moment that enslaved Black people landed on these shores. That's when that movement began in the United States. And I know that is different internationally, but that is certainly true here domestically. And I think I've learned, right, to appreciate that for so many, their perspectives have everything to do with where they enter in, right? For some people, the beginning of the movement is how they got politicized. Maybe it was around Sean Bell being murdered, on his wedding night. Perhaps it was being politicized around Amadou Diallo, who was shot 41 times, right? Perhaps it was about being politicized around Abner Louima, who was sodomized by police officers in New York. Or perhaps you were politicized through Hurricane Katrina, right? Perhaps you were politicized around Oscar Grant, or perhaps you were politicized around Trayvon Martin or Mike Brown, or, the whole litany of names of people who have been stolen from us. So I've learned that, right? And in the book, I talk about how it is important, even with that dynamic, to have a broader picture of where we come from so that we know where we're headed. And to not kind of, to be careful, I should say, about defining movement from where you enter into it, understanding that the world is much bigger than us. The other thing that I think I've learned in particular, right, is how necessary movement building really is. I think about all the people who are suffering right now for various reasons. I think a lot of us are paying attention to what's happening in Atlanta, right, where 8 people were murdered, and 6 of those people were Asian women, murdered by a 21-year-old white kid, right? And I think about the fact that without movement, right? Without movement, we would be telling a very different story right now. We'd be having a very different conversation right now. And I'm grateful for every opportunity there is to get it more right, right? I don't know that we ever get it exactly right, but I am grateful for all the easy and hard conversations that have to happen about what it means to come together and what we have to overcome in order to come together, and who we need to keep pushing each other and ourselves to be in order for that coming together to have any kind of impact whatsoever. So that is something that I've learned. And I've also learned that our vision can be much bigger. And so often we define ourselves by the things that we lack. And it's a hard habit to break. It's a hard habit to break. I find, right, that when there is abundance, right, when we do have power, when we are shifting conversations, where we are shifting and changing laws, right, and replacing the people who make them, that we often didn't think we were going to get to that place. So we didn't actually start to think about what we wanted to do with it when we got it. And, you know, for so many of us, we're so used to not having, right, that when abundance does come, and it does come, it's what it is. When you are successful, when you are effective, you do get access to more of the things that you need. And at the same time, it requires that our movements have the ability to articulate what it would look like, what we want to do with that power, right? What we want to do with that access, what we want to do with that level of influence. And that is often where things get sticky. So I have been thinking a lot about what it means to lean into a vision where we're successful, and not just a vision for where we're fighting for every little thing, right? And I've tried to do more of that work with the Black Futures Lab. Frankly, you know, I have not been involved in BLM, in the day-to-day work of BLM, for more than 3 years now. So, you know, it's awesome to see it grow. It's awesome to see it grow as a fellow traveler and not inside of the thing. And it encourages me in my role at the Black Futures Lab to really lean into what our role is, which is making our communities powerful in these processes so that we can be powerful in every aspect of our lives.
I know that some people have trouble because they're still working in that deficit mindset. They have trouble imagining how it is that our communities can come together, because they're quick to point out that a lot of people in our communities who need to come together share core concerns, what benefit from coming together, also hold negative stereotypes about one another, and also can tell you about a negative experience they've had with the very group that they need to unite with. And so what do you say to that?
You know, it's really interesting. I talk about this in the book, and it's one of my favorite stories, because I like to remind people that, you know, these stories that we tell ourselves about how we're the only messed up people in the rainbow of people, it's just not true. I can confirm, right, that, you know, Black folks be like, oh, Black people would come together, things could happen, but we don't take care of ourselves like the Asians take care of each other. And I'm like, the Asians talk about each other like that too. They'd be like, why don't we come together like the Blacks come together? And then the Latinx folks talk about each other like that too. Everybody's having the same conversation. Meanwhile, ain't nobody coming together. That's the problem. So I think the grass is greener where you water it, right? And I think that ultimately what we're trying to do here is figure out what gets in the way. And what gets in the way is not each other. And I think that that is a narrative that has been designed over time that maybe had good intentions, maybe, but I think it ultimately blames us for conditions that we didn't create. And I think the better story to tell, right, is how have people learned to survive under the worst conditions possible? And where are some of our survival mechanisms getting in the way of us actually surviving and being free? That is the conversation that I want us to have. And I think it's necessary for us to have it, especially in this moment. if we don't all get on the same page about what's important and who we need to be in this moment, we are risking the reemergence of the thing that we temporarily put down. That's what's at stake, right? So, we don't have time to be doing all that, okay? We have bigger fish to fry, because ultimately, if we don't get clearer about this conversation, by the time this other thing rolls around, honey, it's going to be too late. And you're not going to be worried about what other Black people are doing. You're going to be worried about trying to stay alive. So that's that on that.
That's that on that. And in fact, you start pushing us in this direction in the book. Like, I mean, there's so much in the book that we won't be able to cover tonight, but I just want to sort of pull out this a little quote. Controlling the story of who we are and what makes us who we are is an exercise of power. And this is a central theme in the book about the sort of the controlling that story, controlling that narrative. And so how can we learn to engage in controlling that narrative, both at a personal and at a national or global level?
Well, the first thing I think we have to consider is really investing in storytelling infrastructure. Right now, all of the stories that are being told about us are not being told by us, right? And they're certainly not being told for us. And I could give a million examples of this, but the work that I would lift up is the work that Color of Change does, trying to change Hollywood, change the way that we tell Black stories, because the way we tell Black stories has impact on Black policy. And if we are, for example, telling stories about how the reason that Black people aren't being vaccinated is because Black people don't want the vaccine, as opposed to be able to have access to it. And it also means, right, we're not changing rules that are barriers to our communities getting it, like the rules where in the southern part of the United States, right, Republican legislators for years now have been blocking federal funding to expand access to healthcare for some of the poorest people, right? And some of the poorest people in the South are Black people, okay? So this is the impact of why stories matter. And I do think that, we are constantly going up against a machine that wasn't built by us, and it certainly wasn't built for us. So we need to build the kind of infrastructure that can compete and intervene and interrupt, while also holding the massive infrastructure accountable for the way that it talks about us, talks about who we are and what we need, what we deserve and what we don't deserve. I think the other piece of this, frankly, though, is I hope this isn't controversial, but I'm gonna say it.
It's all right. It's all right.
I feel like sometimes the conversations about Black people get stunted, and we stunt our own stories in some ways. We have to have a commitment to having range and depth around the why Black stories matter. And it's not just because we're Black, and it's not because Black people are better than any other person, right? Black people don't have any special inherent powers, right? It's not that. It's that what happens to Black people materially, economically, socially, politically, gets exported to other people. So the worst things that happen to Black folks, right, will eventually happen to other people. But that also means that the best things that happen to Black people can also happen to others. And so that is what we are driving for here. And if we constantly kind of have this narrative of you just have to do it because we're Black, that is not a useful conversation for movement building. I say, and we say at the Black Futures Lab and the Black to the Future Action Fund, that what is good for Black people is good for America. Black people don't have healthcare, honey. There's a lot of other people that don't have healthcare too. Okay, so if Black people have healthcare, right, other people can get access to healthcare, because Black folks are at the bottom when it comes to disparities, alongside our Indigenous brothers and sisters, right? So there's that on that. And lastly, I'll just say that I think we have to be careful, and I talk about this in the book, we have to be careful about adopting stories that are not ours as our own. I think that story about Black delinquency is not a Black story, but it's a story that we've adopted, and it serves a purpose, right? I think that the stories about, Black people lacking integrity, they're not our stories, but they are stories that we take on and we adopt. And what they serve to do, frankly, is keep us divided and keep us unorganized and keep us scattered and keep us from fighting the people who are creating scarcity in our communities in the first place.
Oh, um, that was a needed conversation.
You know.
and I know, and it's one of those moments where sometimes people say, "Oh, it's just PR or right, narratives or no. They have causal force in the world.
That's right. That's right. I mean, look at the story of making America great again, right? I mean, a lot of people think that came from Donald Trump. It didn't. It actually started with Ronald Reagan, who was president when I was born. And it was attached to a whole agenda that we are seeing play out in real time right now. That story has power. The notion of making America great again is also driving, right, some of the tragedies that we're seeing in this country and around the world. The tragedies that we saw in Atlanta last night, the tragedy of storming the Capitol building and trying to overtake the government, the tragedies of Black people being murdered, right? The tragedy of Donald Trump deploying tear gas on protesters for a photo op to show, right, what it would look like if America was great again. These stories do actually have power. They have influence and they have purpose and they have impact.
And one of the stories that you tell in the book is about not only what we do here in the U.S., but you take this global outlook and you connect our struggles with struggles that are happening across the global South and elsewhere. And this really sort of struck a chord with me because I have an old friend in South Africa who's a retired social worker. And he sent me a note a few months back to say, COVID-19 is hitting them really hard, but it looks like the rich of the world will get help before anyone else yet again, and maybe even to the exclusion of Black and brown folks across the world. And as someone who wants to take a transnational outlook on justice, what advice would you give me and others to say, what do I say to this friend of mine? What can we do?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I think the first step is to recognize that we're not the center of the universe. And for so many of us in this country, we are only concerned with what is happening in the United States. We do not have a global perspective. We don't have a global perspective on how what happens in the United States impacts the rest of the world. And we don't have a global perspective on the policies that this country exports around the world that creates the same dynamics that we see domestically on a global scale.
Alicia, it appears that one of us may be frozen. And so it looks like you're frozen just for a bit, and I'll wait for you to come back. But as we wait, I just want to remind everyone of the importance of looking beyond the U.S., even for things that we think are very U.S. centered. Are we about to get Alicia back? Okay. So hold on. She should be back in just a moment. And while we wait, since the book is just here, I'm just going to kind of do something that I love to do, at least in seminar, because I have all of these pages that are marked. that are just really striking in the book. And so I will read one short passage, and hopefully she will be just back. So let's go with the first passage. She talks about organizing as a process of coming together. And she writes, it's part of all the things we do every day to survive, to feed ourselves, to express ourselves, to restore ourselves. Humans are social creatures. Connection is at the core of who we are. And organizing is connecting with the purpose. The reason this is so striking is the recognition of what it means to be a social creature, what it means to be connected, and under what circumstances is being connected difficult? Under what circumstances does being connected mean that we will experience outcomes that are the opposite of those that we intend as we engage in our organizing? The other thing that I think is incredibly important in our conversation is this discussion of what narratives do. And so what you'll remember is that she talked about these moments in which people, a police officer, a sheriff, practice discretion when encountering her and her friend. This could have been a very serious encounter. It could have made the difference between her going to college or not. It could have made it could have brought a lot of change into her life. For him to be able to practice discretion means that he had access to a different kind of narrative about the kind of person she might be, and what kinds of behaviors toward her would be appropriate. And so one of the questions we have to ask ourselves are, what are the kinds of narratives that are out there about the permissible? I've too often heard people say that a person who ended up being shot by the police simply should have obeyed instructions. And so here we get a sense that there is a narrative out there about obedience. And when someone fails to be obedient, somehow all sorts of actions toward that individual are permissible. And what she's trying to do here is ask us, what can we do in our movement building to change those narratives? What can we do to bring about moments of discretion that are life-saving? And we have to be intentional when we do this. And much of the lessons that she brings out in the book are about how can we be more intentional as we do this. And one way we can be more intentional, she notes, is that we can pay greater attention to the histories that have created the problems that we're facing in the first place. And so those of us who are unaware of our histories and unaware of the histories of various social movements, we tend to find ourselves surprised, caught off guard. And what history can do for us is it can help us not just be better guarded, but be more open to possibilities. Because what history tells us is simply that while we see conditions in the way that they are today, they could have gone a different way. History shows us that there were paths not taken, paths nearly taken. And what we have to get better at doing is understanding what those pathways were. And so every time someone tells me that something was inevitable, I tell them it might have been highly likely, but think again. And what this book does is it invites us to think again, No, I don't want to sound like a sort of Pollyanna-ish, and pretend that we can change things just by virtue of wanting them changed. Um, but if we can't articulate a vision of what that change can look like and why it can look that way, then the change isn't possible. Because I think we sometimes forget just how focused on narratives we are as a species, how focused we are on narratives as a society, and how our public policies and practices really work to affirm sort of these dominant narratives out there. They work to affirm what we see and what we think we ought to see. And so with that, let me welcome back Alicia Garza. Welcome back.
You know what?
You know what? My mama calls it the devil, but
You know what I'm saying? I'm like, y'all trying it, but we gonna finish it, whether you want us to finish it or not.
There was too much truth, I think.
You know, yeah, it got too hot.
It got hot and the lines fell.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all right. That's all right. Welcome back.
Yeah, we back. We back.
Oh my goodness! Thank you. Thanks for coming back.
Thank you for having me back.
And while you're back, what is some advice to people more generally, particularly young people, who want to be involved in real change, but might be overwhelmed or not sure where to start?
You know, my advice is threefold. Number one, figure out what it is that you care about. For me, I fell into that when I was 12. I grew up for the first part of my life with a single mom who didn't expect to be a single mom. And so she ended up talking to me a lot about sex. And she said, sex makes babies and babies are expensive. So when I heard that in my school district, there was a whole proposal to put condoms in school nurses' offices, and people started freaking out, I was like, well, sex makes babies and babies are expensive. Don't you want to prevent that? You know, so it's something that I came to care about, and I got involved because it was something that I cared about and that impacted me. So take the time to figure out what it is that you care about. It's fine to be passionate about everything, right? But you can't always impact everything. So pick a thing that you want to impact. Then find other people who care about the same things that you do and join them. And when you join them, bring other people with you. The only way that change happens, right, is when people who are impacted, people who care, get together to better understand why the things that are happening to us are happening to us and what we can do about it, and then implement those plans, right? And that has to happen at scale. Okay, it has to happen with other people. The other thing I would offer is try not to be discouraged. This is a marathon and not a sprint. And often I think protests in particular can feel like sprints. It can feel like, okay, you know, we got to do everything as hard as we possibly can. And at the end of it, we're going to get something. That is rarely how things work. Actually, change happens slowly. It happens over time. Some change does happen very quickly, but most changes that we long for have to happen over time. So don't get discouraged. I really do believe that cynicism and despair is a poison pill for the kind of work that we're trying to do. And it doesn't mean things are always going to be easy. It doesn't mean people aren't going to disappoint you, frustrate you, hurt you, do you wrong, right? I mean, movements are not utopias. They're not places where everybody does right, acts right, does the thing they're supposed to do. Actually, movements are quite messy. They're the place where people who are deeply human with all their flaws and all their attributes come together to try to accomplish something bigger than themselves. And that means that all that stuff gets in the mix too. So it's to be expected. I'm not saying you have to tolerate it now. I'm just saying, don't act like it's not going to be there, because it's definitely going to be there. So be aware of that. and try and stay hopeful and grounded, not just in purpose, but in vision, in what it is that you are trying to achieve. People get on my nerves every day, and today is no different. Let me tell you. I started off the day with people on my last nerve, and I'll probably go to sleep tonight with people on my last nerve. But you know what? That does not deter me from the work that I am set out to do. And it is the work of making Black people powerful in every aspect of our lives that keeps me coming back. And it helps me move through all the times when people tap dance on my last nerve. And I learn each time it wasn't actually my last nerve.
All the lessons. And so before I turn to the audience questions, because I know we're tight on time, do you want to say just a word about what's next for the Black Futures Lab?
Absolutely. So right now we are focused on making sure that we are setting the terms for the Biden-Harris administration. At the Black Futures Lab and at the Black to the Future Action Fund, which is our kind of political arm, we are pushing to make sure that the change that is happening in this period is not just trying to get to better or good enough, but that it's bold. We need bold change in order to meet the challenges of this moment, from white nationalism and white terrorism to a lack of access to healthcare, relief and recovery from COVID-19, economic well-being, and then certainly the climate crisis, which is impacting us all. And in order for that to occur, right, the Biden-Harris administration needs a mandate from Black communities about where to even begin, right? So we are working very hard to set that floor in relationship to our partners on the ground in 12 states across the country. And we are activating and mobilizing the 2 million Black voters that we talked to in 2020 to help us make that happen. So that's what we're focused on. And also really trying to make sure that we are helping to shape the culture wars that we're in. It's not lost on me, right? That every time conservatives lose a thing, the time that they spend rebuilding is really spent trying to shape ideas. And so all of these like anti-trans laws, right? All this like cancel culture nonsense, all this stuff, all these buzzwords, right? Are ways to draw lines in the sand and to shape the story of who we are and who we can be together. So we are also fighting on that front, making sure that we're putting out the other message, right? Which is, it's not about people being too sensitive. It's not about people canceling each other, child, because if people were going to be canceled, y'all would have been canceled. What it's actually about, right, is making sure that we invest in Black communities so that we're investing in America. So we're working on that as well. And there's a couple of other things we got going on. The paperback of this book is coming out in the summer, and we're updating it. So there'll be some new content in there. And we'll be talking a little bit. I'm not going to give it all away now because you don't have to go on and get it. But we are talking about what lessons the Reconstruction era can offer us for the new Reconstruction that we're in now.
Yeah, I can honestly say there's so much in the book that we didn't even get close to covering. So you didn't give too much away.
Okay,
so let me just go to our audience. So one person noted, I faithfully listen to your podcast every Friday. It's consistently good. So how do you select your guest?
It's just people I want to talk to. Honestly, I'm so blessed having been in this work for so long. There's a lot of people that I know, and I want people to get to know them too. And so part of what we try and do with this podcast is introduce people to people they didn't know that are doing incredible work. And I'm trying to help expand people's universe, right? So, some of the people that come on the pod are people I've known for 1,000 years and who I want everybody else to know. Other folks are people that I've just met, but I find them deeply interesting. I know that they have something to say and something to offer us for how to navigate this particular moment. So I try to pick people that, that we can have a real conversation with too. I always say, as much as I love Trevor Noah, right? This is not a Trevor Noah kind of show where people come on and they kind of talk about their new projects, right? This is really a show where you get to know the people behind the person. And that's what I find so valuable about it. It teaches me a lot. And I hope, for people who are listening, that they enjoy it as well.
Yes, another audience member had this to say. Republicans are undertaking a national effort to stop Black people from voting. What can be done to stop this?
Oh, well, my sister Latasha is over here handling business. She's from Black Voters Matter. She's the co-founder. And they just launched a very public campaign targeting some of the companies that we know very well that are actually funding these kinds of efforts. Companies like Delta, companies like Coca-Cola, companies like Home Depot, right? Companies, oh yes, there's a whole list of them, honey. And so it's important, right, that we get to their financial backers. I mean, everybody want to talk about Black Lives Matter, but then they also want to fund voter suppression. You can't do both, honey. You gotta, it's one or the other. So go to blackvotersmatter.org so you can sign up and get involved in that campaign. They're doing incredible work, making sure that they're holding corporations accountable for the ways in which they're disenfranchising our communities. And then also they are pushing for legislation in Congress to re-enfranchise voters. So please, please, please get involved with their work.
Thank you. And then our last question, and it's always hard to figure out which, because there's so many that have been submitted, but I'll take this one. How do we avoid making, in quotes, wokeness another form of othering?
Oh, I have so much to say about this, but let me start and end here. I was actually recording my podcast for this week, and I was talking to somebody who I love. You're going to love her too when you hear the episode. She is a nationally recognized slam poet, an artist, a writer, an author, just basically a badass. And I was telling her that I hate slam poetry. that I love her and her craft, but that often I feel like the craft has gotten stale. And I think the same is true of wokeness, right? And she reflected back to me, well, she said, so much of this kind of spoken word culture is a young people's movement. And so it reflects people's first awareness of structural issues and their experiences with that. And so that is why it sounds repetitive, right? Because people are coming to realizations that many of us have already come to, and we've been grappling with those for a while. And I think wokeness is the same. Honestly, I think when people come into consciousness about a thing that is wrong or isn't working, people like to become evangelists and proselytizers. And I did the same thing. Let me tell you something. I came home from college and I wanted to run my parents down about everything. I ran them down. I said, oh, I can't believe you don't know about this. I can't believe you're doing this. I can't believe that. I can't believe this. And they ran me down in return. They said, listen here. Okay. What you're doing right now is not actually engaging me, changing my mind, educating me, or getting me to think differently about anything. So on the one hand, I feel like when we learn a new thing that we're really passionate about, on the best side of it, right, we can be so eager to get other people involved that we can be relentless in our pursuit of doing so. On the other hand, that relentless pursuit has to also be in tune with compassion and listening and empathy, and also understanding that your perspective is not the only perspective that exists in the world. And so I don't know if it's woke culture, and I don't think that it's attached to young people. I think lots of different people kind of can be in this tendency. At best, it's passion, and at worst, I think it lacks understanding of what moves people to do something different than what they've done before. And oftentimes what moves people is themselves. It's not your preaching. So I hope that was a helpful offering here.
It's preaching versus power.
That's right. That's right.
Preaching versus power. So, and with that, let me just offer our sincere thanks for your generosity tonight, both an intellectual generosity, but also a generosity of spirit. And this is clearly something that comes from a real place. And I think that reading the book, it just, whatever you thought, for those of us who have been around for a while, whatever we thought we were doing, the book invites us to do some rethinking. And so that is its own gift. And so thank you so much. And if you don't have the book, go get it.
Thank you
if you're
so much.
not involved in
My name is Sabrina King, and I've been working at Princeton for 15 years. I am a 2001 graduate of Princeton. Every year that I spend at Princeton, you realize the depth of how much goes into running the university and making the students